Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager. Kim McCleary, our President and CEO, wishes she could join us for the first program of 2023, but her husband is having complications from a recent surgery and she's unfortunately able to be with us this evening. Tonight, we would like to welcome the members of the other California World Affairs Councils. Thank you to the Desert, San Diego, Sonoma County, Orange County, Inland SoCal, and Monterey Bay for joining us. We have a terrific lineup of in-person and live stream programs coming up this month and next, so please stay tuned for a quick update at the end of today's program. Please submit your questions for Dan into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. In about half an hour, I'll come back on for the Q&A where we'll answer your questions. It is now my pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur, politics professor at UC Berkeley, USC, and Pepperdine. We have a great topic for you all tonight, opening the curtain on 2023, new year, new Congress, and new challenges. Dan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Hey, Rachel, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us for our first program of the year. And like Rachel said, I want to especially thank the members of all the other California World Affairs Councils. We're excited to have you with us, and we hope you'll join in our questioning in the second half of the program. And I hope that some of you have also signed up for the 30-minute, what I call our post-game show that takes place from 6 to 6:30 Pacific time for members of the council. And if you're not signed up for tonight, we hope you'll sign up for that conversation in the future. So look, today's conversation is not exactly what we had planned it to be. When Rachel and I first talked several weeks ago, when we set January 3rd as the date for our first webinar of 2023, we anticipated a look back at last year and a look ahead at what to expect in the year before us. What we didn't plan on was being in the middle of a battle for the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives, which, as I'm guessing most of you know by now, for the first time in exactly 100 years, the election of a speaker is not simply a matter of protocol, and after multiple ballots today, has yet to be resolved. Now, the House finally adjourned for the day a couple of hours ago, after 3 consecutive votes in which Republican leader Kevin McCarthy failed to get a majority of the votes he needed to become speaker. Now, we do know, of course, that the next speaker will be a Republican, but every ballot on which the members vote, on which McCarthy comes up short, makes it less likely that that speaker is going to be him. Many of you may remember that 7 years ago, McCarthy was in line to be Speaker of the House of Representatives also. And it became clear to him at the last minute that he simply did not have the votes. He stepped aside, and Paul Ryan went on to become the House Speaker back in 2016. And here we are now in 2023. And unlike 7 years ago, McCarthy has decided to go forward, but at least so far, he hasn't been able to come up with the votes. Now, as recently as this morning, McCarthy pledged to continue to fight no matter how many ballots were required, because he assumed that the Republican rebels, somewhere between 5 and 20 Republican House members who said they would not vote for him, would eventually be worn down and simply give in so the House could move forward. Well, that didn't happen today. And after 3 ballots, 19 Republicans voted against their leader on the first 2, and one additional voted against him on the third, at which point the House did adjourn for the night. And that adjournment is really important, not just for timing reasons, but for strategic reasons. And let me explain what I'm saying. McCarthy had said this morning, as I mentioned a moment ago, that he was prepared to fight all the way through. And so most of the members on both sides, both McCarthy's supporters and his opponents, believed that this could go way out late into the night and perhaps the early morning hours before one side or the other capitulated. And again, that didn't happen. And I'm not brave enough, and I'm not foolish enough to make any predictions on how this is going to come out. What I will say is this: the fact that Kevin McCarthy allowed his supporters to vote for an adjournment this afternoon means, in my mind at least, that McCarthy has allowed perhaps his best opportunity to win the speaker's gavel, to slip away from him, perhaps forever. Now, the reason I say that is because a speaker doesn't need a majority of the House membership to get elected. A candidate doesn't need 218 votes out of 435, or today 434 members. Rather, and this is an important distinction, a speaker doesn't require a majority of the House membership. Rather, a speaker requires a majority of those House members who actually cast a vote for a candidate or those who just vote present. So all 212 Democrats voted for their new leader, Hakeem Jeffries, today on all 3 ballots. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that a few dozen Democrats, 30 or 40, were to leave the floor and not vote. That would lower the threshold for McCarthy or anyone else's majority from 218 to a much lower number. So it looked like what McCarthy might have been hoping by promising to fight all day and all night. It looked like McCarthy might have been hoping that if the votes went late enough into the evening, that a certain number of Democratic members might have simply given up and gone home. Like I said, either way, it was going to be a Republican speaker. And while they wanted to show their support for their new leader, Hakeem Jeffries, after a certain point, it's just not worth sticking around. And it's entirely possible to see how McCarthy and his advisors might have thought, if enough Democrats leave, McCarthy will be able to get that majority with a lower vote total. That's not going to happen because everybody went home tonight. And so my guess is this, is that after McCarthy meets with the 20 Republican rebels to see what, if anything, can be done to bring them into McCarthy's camp, and probably in all likelihood finding out that there isn't anything that can be done, McCarthy and his advisors will then turn to the Democratic House leadership late tonight to see if the Democrats can be convinced to support McCarthy, not to vote for him. They're not going to do that. They're going to vote for their leader. But McCarthy's going to try to convince the Democratic leaders that some of their members should tacitly support McCarthy by staying off the floor tomorrow. In other words, McCarthy might be trying to convince the Democrats that while they might not like him very much, he'd be a better speaker for them to deal with and negotiate with than a more conservative alternative. Now, that's a long shot. McCarthy has no real relationship with President Biden or the White House, and he doesn't have any real relationship with either the new Democratic leader, Jeffries, or the former leader, Nancy Pelosi. Now, by contrast, for example, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden don't get along very well either, but they've known each other for many years, and they've worked together a lot over the years. And they've developed a level of mutual regard, even if it's grudging regard, that has allowed them to team up over the years when it's necessary. McCarthy doesn't have that, which means that eventually the Republican members are going to agree to a compromise candidate at some point, but it's looking less and less likely like it's going to be Kevin McCarthy. Who is it? Well, your guess is as good as mine. And of course, we can speculate when we get to the bottom of the hour and get into your questions. But for now, I think it's worth taking a step back and reminding ourselves that this monthly webinar is not supposed to be a nightly news program, but rather a broader analysis of the political landscape. So I think what I'd like to do, at least for now, is let's set aside the speaker drama, at least until we get to your questions. And instead, let's get to our first question for all of you. So Katie, can you put up the first question of the year for our group? Question 1 for all of you. Who will be the second most important political leader in the United States this year? And I want to make it clear here, I'm not asking who you like or who you don't like. What I'm asking is that after Joe Biden, the president of the United States, which of these alternatives, which of these leaders will have the greatest impact on politics in America over the next 12 months? Will it be Kevin McCarthy or his replacement or his alternative as Republican Speaker? Will it be Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Majority Leader? Will it be Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate Leader? Will it be Hakeem Jeffries, who I've just mentioned is taking over for Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic House Leader? Or will it be Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, who's no longer going to have to break all those ties in the Senate, now that it's no longer a 50-50 tie? Katie, how do we do? What did our group have to say in the answer to this first question? Oh, Very interesting. It looks like a very split decision. Only 1% said Kamala Harris. I guess that's what happens for vice presidents when there isn't a 50-50 tie in the Senate. But otherwise, this is pretty close. 38%, a little bit more than a third, think that Schumer, the Democratic Senate leader, the Senate Majority Leader, will have the most impact. 23% say McConnell, leading the Senate Republicans. 21% still say the House Speaker. I think pointing out appropriately that even if there's a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, that Republican House majority is still very important. And a smaller number, 17%, Hakeem Jeffries. Hey, Hakeem Jeffries will have the most impact. Now, incidentally, speaking of those players, when the House reconvenes tomorrow to try again to elect a speaker, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell will be appearing together at a joint press conference in McConnell's home state of Kentucky for an event promoting the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed last year. And with them will be the Republican governor of Ohio and the Democratic governor of Kentucky. So compared to what's going to be going on in the House, that will be quite a contrast. And it's a very deliberate contrast by both Biden and McConnell, both of whom want to demonstrate that they're approaching the year ahead in a much different way than the House Republicans are. So let's look at what's ahead in 2023. And what do you think are the prospects for additional bipartisan progress? Now, there is a daunting set of challenges that Washington will be facing this year. But what's interesting to me is that those challenges are coming in at least two different stages. The first stage are a series of urgent problems, if not downright emergencies. The economic twin threats of inflation and recession, the prospect of a huge influx of migrants at the US-Mexico border, the ongoing fight over abortion protections and restrictions, and of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine, which seems to continue to worsen by the day. And that's just the beginning. There's a dozen or so other topics we could be addressing, but in the interest of time, let's start with just that list right now. And Katie, I'm going to ask you again if we can go back to our group for their thoughts. And I'm hoping all of you can tell us, which do you think is the most important policy challenge that President Biden and the Congress will face this year? Now, you get one choice, which I realize is somewhat unfair. And I realize there are plenty of other options that we don't have the technology to include on these questions. But of the five that are up here, which do you think is the most important issue that Biden and Congress will be dealing with in 2023? Will it be economy and the inflation? Will it be abortion as part of the broader and the broader healthcare debate? Will it be the border and immigration? Not only the brewing crisis over Title 42 at the border right now, but the broader argument about how to resolve a broken system of immigration in this country. Or will it be something on the foreign policy landscape, Russia or China or something else? Or will it be something else altogether? And Katie, let's see what our group came up with for this one. This one's a little bit less evenly balanced. 50% exactly, well, actually a little bit more than half of you, say economy and inflation will be the most important issue that Washington will deal with this year. Foreign policy and immigration come in second at 24 and 23%. And then way down at the bottom, 2% say something else, and only 1% believe that abortion will be the most important issue that Washington deals with this year, which is noticeable because if I can remind you that when we polled in November, a plurality of you, more than on any other issue, most of our audience, most of our group, felt that abortion would be one of the most important issues in the campaign, apparently not going into 2023. Now, none of these issues are going to be easy with the Congress divided between the two parties, and especially with the House Republican caucus making it clear that they're going to be investigating the Biden administration on any number of issues, no matter who ultimately becomes the speaker. But there's still work to be done, and so let's talk about some of those challenges. Well, the one you pointed out as the one of greatest concern is the economy. It's an excellent story in this morning's New York Times by Jim Tankersley, talking about how Biden has had more impact on economic issues than any other president in modern times. And what Tankersley also points out is that a large portion of the administration's responsibilities over the next year or two are going to be overseeing the implementation of legislation that has already been passed, as opposed to new bills that have to get through Congress, which is good news for Biden, given the divided Congress and the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. And I think we all know that the delicate balancing act between controlling inflation on one hand and potentially causing a recession on the other is the direct responsibility of the Federal Reserve Board and its chairman, Jerome Powell. But even if Powell manages to navigate this very tricky path without running the country into economic disaster this year, there's still a more fundamental economic and inflationary challenge that Biden's going to face and his successors are going to face for years to come. So let's concentrate on inflation for a moment, because even as the Fed works as hard as it can by raising interest rates to keep inflation under control, other policy decisions being made in Washington have the potential to exacerbate inflation in the years ahead. And what I'm talking about, among other things, is the US's, I think, laudable, if not necessary, efforts to wean our nation from fossil fuels, because that effort to fight climate change has created a very difficult contradiction for policymakers who worry about the impact of climate change on our planet, but who are also wary of the impact of rising energy prices on American consumers. So a heightened commitment to clean energy is a necessary weapon in the fight against climate change. But even large government subsidies can't hide the increased costs of environmentally conscious energy exploration, energy production, and energy use. And Biden's tiptoed around this contradiction. But saving the planet is expensive. And the short-term cost of more expensive gasoline, of more expensive home heating oil, and of broader use of electric vehicles will continue to squeeze working class voters for the foreseeable future. And so the long-term challenges of climate change and the short-term economic and inflationary challenges, to a large degree, work in conflict with each other. And we haven't yet heard a plausible answer from any political leader in either party to talk about how to resolve that contradiction. Now, an even more highly charged policy debate is the one at the US-Mexico border, where the Biden administration is preparing for an immense increase in the number of asylum seekers hoping for refuge in this country. It appeared that so-called Title 42, the Trump-era executive order, which allowed asylum seekers to be removed from this country because of the threat of COVID, it looked like that Title 43 was going to be taken off last week. And in the last minute, the US Supreme Court decided to keep it in place. The problem being is that at some point, when the US government acknowledges that the threat of COVID is no longer sufficient to prevent asylum seekers from entering the country, that's going to lead to an outpouring of migration across our southern border, creating all sorts of policy and real world challenges at the border and throughout the country. And for those of you who didn't see it, there's been in the news today, on the heels of a controversy in which the Republican governors of Florida and Texas have been sending undocumented immigrants to northern Democratic-controlled cities to bring attention to the challenge of undocumented immigration in this country. For those of you who didn't see it, the Democratic governor of Colorado today, Jared Polis, announced that he was going to begin shipping undocumented immigrants from Colorado to New York City. Now, Polis is a Democrat, not a Republican. Colorado is certainly not a border state, But we're already, even while the COVID era regulations remain in effect, we're seeing an immense strain on the US system of immigration. And that can't hold much longer. Just last month, Congress made a last ditch and what I would call a fairly half-hearted effort toward a legislative compromise that would have both addressed the crises at the border and provided a solution for the hundreds of thousands of young people, the so-called dreamers who came to this country with their parents when they were young, to provide them with a pathway to legalization and to citizenship. The bill got a little bit of debate in Congress, not much effort from the White House to push it through, and not surprisingly, nothing happened. And I will just simply say that if these issues couldn't be addressed in a one-party Washington over the last 2 years, the prospect of them being resolved in a divided capital before the next presidential election, well, is infinitesimal. Now, only 1% of you said that abortion was going to be one of the most important issues facing the country this year. But it is worth noting that the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade last June has already had a significant political impact, but the real-world ramifications are just beginning to play out. And while I think reasonable people can argue about whether it's as pressing a policy issue as the economy or the border, it's worth noting that each of 50 states is right now preparing for a very difficult set of decisions on whether and how to allow access to legal abortion. Once again, just like on the economy, just like on immigration, there's a short-term urgency, but it's followed by a much broader and longer-lasting challenge that's not going to go away in the next year or the next several years. And then finally, the other great challenge that the president and the country face is on the international stage. Now, Biden, like any president, depends a lot less on Congress on matters of foreign policy than on domestic issues. So he has much more of a free hand to shape US and, for that matter, world strategy on Russia and China and other global hotspots. But here's yet another here and now emergency. In this case, Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine, which has long-term ramifications. In this case, for how America and our allies deal with China's equally aggressive, though less conspicuous, global aspirations and aggressive tendencies. Let me explain. It's difficult to think of a war as bloody and destructive as what we're seeing in Ukraine as a prelude to anything. But even as the violence in Eastern Europe escalates, Biden and his team have kept a close eye on the Pacific Rim because they know that China is very closely monitoring the Western reaction to the Russian invasion. And as China watches the way the West has united in support of Ukraine, it's clearly had a measurable impact on their own thoughts about aggressive action toward Taiwan and beyond. Before the war started, as you may remember, the leaders of the two countries appeared together and proclaimed themselves to be lifelong friends. Well, since then, China has been a lot more measured in its support of Russia, and in fact, at times has called for peace in Eastern Europe. And so it's not difficult to believe that the Chinese leadership are making decisions about their own plans in Taiwan and elsewhere based on how they're seeing the West respond in Ukraine. It's chilling to think of Ukraine as a dress rehearsal for an even bigger conflict with an even more powerful foe. But China has made very little secret of its expansionist goals. And it's easy to see how that country's leaders could calibrate its strategy and timeline for Taiwan based on Western unity against Putin, whether to decide to wait, given the way the West has supported Ukraine in the war, or alternatively, been tempted to move on Taiwan in the near future based on the distraction that the Ukraine war is causing the US and its allies. So none of these challenges are unsolvable. But in all four cases, meeting the immediate crisis, whether economic, immigration, abortion, international policy, meeting the immediate crisis is only the first step toward taking on a much more sprawling and seminal set of problems. Now, Biden's not going to fix any of these issues between now and next November. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the progress he makes on them probably will have a significant impact on whether he gets 4 more years in 2024 to continue his efforts. So with all that, I know I covered a lot of policy ground there on 4 different issues. So I've got 2 questions now that I'm going to ask Katie to pose to you for you to consider. The first one is, on which issue of the ones that we've just mentioned, you've told us which you think are the most important. Now, on which of these issues do you think Biden will make the most progress this year? Will he be most successful on economic issues, on issues relating to abortion and healthcare, on border and immigration policy, or on foreign policy, international challenges like Russia and China, or something else? You've told us which you think are the most important. Now tell us which ones do you think Biden, and for that matter, Congress, will make the most progress this year. What did our group have to say, Katie? Look at that. 55%, more than half of you say the economy and inflation. So not only do more than half of you say that economic issues are the most important, you believe it's the one where Biden will make the most progress this year. 31%, almost a third of you, do believe that he'll make progress, and I will editorialize for a moment, continue to make progress, at least in Ukraine and Russia. And of course, the challenge of China is something we'll talk about in much more detail again next month. Only 4% of you see much progress on either abortion or immigration issues. Very, very interesting. And so, Katie, for our next question, can you put up our next question, where we're going to reverse what we just asked the group? Instead of asking you on which issue you think Biden will make the most progress, this seems sort of self-evident given the very low numbers we saw for abortion and immigration on the last question. But let's go ahead and play this one out anyway. On which of these 4 issues do you think Biden will be the least successful and make the least progress this year? Will it be economic issues? Will it be abortion policy? Will it be immigration and the border? Or will it be international relations and foreign policy? Where will Washington struggle the most this year? Okay. 66%, 2/3 of our group, doesn't see much progress coming on immigration. A distant second, 23%, a little bit less than a quarter, say not much progress on abortion. And our group tends to be fairly positive, it looks like, at least relatively speaking, on foreign policy and on economic policy. So once again, very interesting numbers to consider. Now, one thing we didn't have a chance to talk about today is how next year's presidential election is shaping up. And I know that we have another 20 or so webinars between now and November 2024. But it's a topic we'll be talking about regularly over the course of this year. And if we're still doing these webinars, then next year too. Because of course, everything that happens on all these issues or more is going to have a material impact on the presidential election. So what we'll talk about in months ahead is whether Biden will seek a second term. It's beginning to look more likely at this point, or whether he'll face a primary challenge, which is now looking less likely. And similarly, we'll talk about how all of this, not just these issues, but the fight for House Speaker today, how that impacts the presidential campaign. Because it's worth remembering that Donald Trump, while he didn't spend a lot of time on it or put a lot of energy into it, Donald Trump did endorse McCarthy for Speaker today. And all 20 of those Republicans who voted against McCarthy in these votes, all were very strong Trump supporters. So going ahead, we'll talk about President Trump and his potential for re-election. We'll talk about Governor Ron DeSantis, who was sworn in for his second term today, in what appears to already look like a very large and growing Republican field. So plenty of time in the future to talk presidential politics. Next month, we'll come back to the international front since we didn't give it the time and attention it deserved today. But for right now, we're right at the bottom of the hour. And so I'm going to ask Rachel to join me, and we'll spend the second half an hour of our program answering as many of your questions as possible.
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much again for joining us today, and to our audience for such great questions. So just jumping right in, what impact do you think Kevin McCarthy's difficulties will have upon implementing the GOP's agenda in this congressional session?
Yeah. Well, there wasn't a lot of prospects coming in for a lot of progress on a Republican policy agenda, if only because the party controls only one of the two houses of Congress and does not control the White House. So it didn't look like there was going to be a lot of Republican policy coming out of Congress anyway, given the Senate and given the presidency. That said, McCarthy and his top advisors have been making it clear for quite some time now that they intend, as I mentioned earlier, to very aggressively investigate all sorts of different aspects of the Biden administration. It appears that they did want to revisit the January 6th investigation, and on a very large number of other fronts, everything from Hunter Biden's financial investments to the pullout of the Biden administration's pullout from Afghanistan and the tragedies that were caused during that at that time. Those plus at least a dozen other topics are matters that the House has pledged to investigate. And at a certain point, they will. But you can't investigate unless you have committees. You can't have committees unless you have members. You can't have members until you have a speaker. And while at some point there will be a Speaker of the House of Representatives, whether it's Kevin McCarthy or anyone else, the more time it takes for this House leadership fight to resolve itself, the more difficult it's going to be for Republicans to have the kind of impact that they hope to, whether on policy or investigations or something else. Now, if McCarthy does not become Speaker, which, as I said earlier, is beginning to look more likely, given the nature of this afternoon's adjournment, the question then becomes what kind of compromise candidate were to take the position instead. That's a longer conversation, which we could get into perhaps later tonight, and certainly more next month. But at least for now, know that the Republicans are going to end up moving together a lot more slowly and a lot less purposefully, given the delays they've had on day one of their majority.
So we had two questions come in that were related about the ongoing speaker situation. So the first audience member said, you indicated that the new speaker will be Republican. There is an article I read today that there's an unusual process that is unlikely but could result in a Democrat getting the position. Can you explain this, please? And then the second audience member asked, why can't the Democrats take advantage of the speaker issue and get behind a person that 5 Republicans like?
Okay. So two really good questions. And you're exactly right, Rachel, they are related. So one, just by way of background, becoming Speaker requires a majority, not of the members of the House of Representatives, but of those who vote. And there's certainly no reason that while historically the minority party has voted unanimously for their party's leader, almost all, not all, but almost all Republicans voted for Kevin McCarthy 2 years ago to be the minority leader under given Speaker Pelosi. And today, all 212 Democrats all voted for Hakeem Jeffries for leader. There's no reason, legally or constitutionally, that Democrats can't vote for a Republican for Speaker. There's no reason, legally or constitutionally, that Republicans couldn't vote for a Democrat for Speaker. But the former is much more likely than the latter for a number of reasons. The most important being is that because Republicans have the majority, they are in a position to wait in a way that the Democrats aren't. And it's unlikely, it's almost impossible to imagine even a small number of Republican House members, even just the 5 that it would require, voting for a Democrat to become Speaker. What's much more plausible is that a number of members of both parties would vote for a compromise candidate for Speaker, one who is a Republican, like McCarthy, but one who is more committed to a bipartisan approach. And it's also a relatively little known fact that a Speaker of the House does not have to be a member of the House of Representatives. And in fact, many of the more centrist Republicans have raised the idea of former Representative Fred Upton of Michigan serving as a compromise candidate for Speaker, as Upton was considered to be a very moderate member of the House during his years there. And the thought of the centrist Republicans being that perhaps the Democrats might be willing to support him if he were to organize the House in a more bipartisan manner. Neither one is all that likely. Getting Republicans to vote for a Democrat for Speaker, like I said, is almost impossible to imagine. But while I could see Democrats being tempted, as I said earlier, to tacitly support McCarthy by stepping aside and simply not voting, it's possible, more possible, but still very improbable, to see large numbers of Democratic House members voting for a Republican, any Republican for Speaker. Interesting historical note before we go on. I know that we have a lot of audience members who join us each month from elsewhere in the country. But for those of you who are in California, like our colleagues at the various World Affairs Councils around the state, for those of you who've either been in the state for many years or are students of California political history, you are almost certainly familiar with the name Willie Brown, who before becoming mayor of San Francisco several years ago, was the longest serving speaker in the history of the California State Assembly. The way Willie Brown, a Democrat from San Francisco, became speaker originally was not by getting a majority of Democratic votes, but by getting all the Republicans in the assembly minority to vote with a minority of Democrats to elect Brown. There were 3 Democrats running for speaker in 1980. One was the future Congressman Howard Berman. A second was the future Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy. And the third was a more junior member, Willie Brown. And it was considered to be a fight between Berman and McCarthy to see which one of them would be Speaker of the State Assembly. And while these two were fighting over all the Democratic votes, Willie Brown quietly convinced all the Republicans to support him, got a number of Democratic votes too, and ended up becoming California Assembly Speaker. Republicans voted for him because they thought that Brown would be the easiest of the 3 to defeat. As I said earlier, Brown went on to be the longest serving speaker in California political history and was known at one point as the self-proclaimed Ayatollah of the California legislature. Such was his power. So I do think there's a scenario in which Democrats might support a more bipartisan Republican than McCarthy. But more likely is that Republicans come to a compromise candidate between themselves. So coming all the way back around to those 2 questions, Rachel, both raised possibilities that are legally and constitutionally possible, but both are very unlikely to happen, just given how polarized Congress and politics in the United States has become in 2023.
Actually, a great segue to our next question, which the audience member asked, is there another Paul Ryan-like figure in the wings for the Republican Party?
Well, there may be. And by a Paul Ryan type figure, I assume what the questioner is asking about is a potential speaker whose focus is primarily on legislation and public policy and less on politics, and therefore might be able to attract the broader support. And the answer is there are probably a few people in the House caucus, the House Republican caucus, who fit that mold or who fit that description. But it is worth noting, of course, that Ryan did not survive as House Speaker. And he finally stepped down because of his inability or unwillingness to deal with Donald Trump's strongest supporters in the House Republican caucus. There are a few names who get mentioned who are considered to be more policy and legislative focused leaders. And the thought is that if one of them became speaker, it's more probable that he would serve for a short period of time on a temporary basis until the caucus was able to come to a longer term decision. The types of names that get mentioned, for example, are a representative from North Carolina, Patrick McHenry, who's known to be very policy focused. Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, the former executive director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, has developed a very strong reputation among those who agree and those who disagree with him in Congress as someone who's very good and very thoughtful on policy. But just like Ryan was not able to survive for an extended period of time as Speaker, I think it's also going to be very difficult for that type of leader to be anything more than a temporary Speaker while the Republican caucus figures out who they want to take the job on a more ongoing basis. So those people are there. One of them might end up in the job as a compromise, if only so the House can get organized and Congress can begin functioning. But it's less likely that that person would hold the job for a sustained period of time.
Great, thank you, Dan. So switching gears to Title 42, we had, again, two similar questions come in. So the first is, what is the legal basis for the courts to rule that the president can't interpret Title 42 in any way the president wishes? And the second question was, if Title 42 is a Trump executive order, why can't it be vacated by the current president?
Okay. So both questions get not just to a specific policy matter regarding the U.S. border. And Title 42, as I mentioned earlier, for those of you who haven't read a lot about it, was an executive order issued during the Trump administration, which prevented asylum seekers from coming into this country or remaining in this country if there was a threat that they might bring the coronavirus into the country with them. So this was a health measure that the Trump administration took, technically speaking, not a measure to curtail immigration, although it obviously had that impact. And the Biden administration from the very beginning has worked to overturn it. But the challenge with executive orders, not just on border policy, but any executive order issued by any president, is the courts have to agree that the president has made the decision for, it's not the right language, but the best I have, for appropriate and necessary reasons. And therefore, conversely, when the president's successor wants to repeal an executive order, they have to demonstrate that an appropriate process was undertaken before that decision was made. So there have been any number of executive orders that Obama issued, that Trump tried to revoke, but was not allowed to by the courts. And this is an example of one that Trump issued that Biden has tried to overturn, that the courts have not allowed. Now, originally, early in Biden's administration, it did appear that eventually the courts would allow Biden's executive order to take hold and that Title 42 would be lifted. But as time passed, it became less certain because a school of judicial thought emerged that argued not that decision should be made because of immigration policy, but if the executive order was originally issued because of health policy, if that health risk no longer existed to the same level, that therefore the executive order was no longer necessary. And that school of thought appeared to carry the day until the US Supreme Court ruled just recently that they would not forbid Biden from repealing Trump's executive order, but would stay Biden's order in order for the policy to be reviewed. In other words, going back to what I said a minute ago, once again, the judicial argument being that these decisions have to be weighed carefully before acted on. And the US Supreme Court wanted to see for themselves that the Biden administration had made appropriate preparations and had done appropriate reflections before overturning the order. But the problem, Rachel, is this is a temporary measure. And at some point, it's not going to be legally or constitutionally possible to keep asylum seekers out of this country based on a health order that was issued because of a virus, which, while still present, is no longer a menace at the level that it was when that executive order was first issued in 2020. And so whether, as I was saying earlier, whether it's sooner, whether it's later, there has been a very large number of asylum seekers and other migrants who have come to the border waiting to come into the US. And so at some point, not if, but when Title 42 is lifted, the political and the real world ramifications are mind-boggling.
So in the same vein, you mentioned Jared Polis sending migrants to New York City. Any thoughts as to why a Democrat governor of a non-border state would do that? He does seem to be someone mentioned as a potential national candidate if Biden doesn't run.
Yeah, this was a news story that I think because of the fight for the speakership didn't get as much attention as would have normally been the case. But going back to what I mentioned earlier, after Governor DeSantis of Florida and Governor Abbott in Texas and then Governor Ducey in Arizona have sent large numbers of undocumented immigrants to northern cities, the fact that a Democratic governor from a non-border state made that decision really does represent a profound change in the nature of the immigration debate in this country. And if you listen to what Paulus had to say, and Mayor Michael Hancock of Denver, also a Democrat, what they both said is that the state and cities simply did not possess the resources to provide the care and support for the number of undocumented immigrants that were coming in to their jurisdiction. And so while they made the decision in a much less confrontational manner than DeSantis and Abbott had last year, ultimately they made the decision for the same reason that DeSantis and Abbott had stated, which is that the federal government has a responsibility to enforce the borders. And if not able to do so, the best way to marshal political support, in their opinion, for more forceful action on this policy is to raise awareness in other parts of the country, like New York City, like Washington, like Chicago, and like other cities where these migrants have been sent. Now, to be clear, Polis has a much different, as a Democrat, has a much different idea on what kind of immigration policy he wants to see enacted at the federal level. DeSantis and Abbott, as conservative Republicans, are much more focused on border enhancement. Polis is a very strong supporter of a pathway to citizenship. But he too, like his Republican colleagues, has said, number one, we simply don't have the resources to care for all these people. And number two, we want the United States Congress and the president of the United States to do much more than they've been doing to take this issue on. And I will make you the prediction. You know how I don't like predictions, Rachel, but I will make you the prediction that Gerald Paulus might be the first Democratic elected official to make a decision like this, but he won't be the last, increasing the pressure to an even greater degree, both on the Biden administration and Congress, to act on an issue that our very smart group thought was very, very unlikely that much progress would be made this year.
Thanks, Dan. So switching gears again to what we might expect in time before the 2024 election, where does energy fit into Biden's success in the next 24 months?
Well, this is also a really smart question. And it's a tricky one because it's difficult to look at energy as a standalone issue. And Biden, while he might not have gone as far as many members of his own party would have liked, he was able to successfully oversee the passage of the most sweeping climate change legislation in this nation's history. It's an issue to which he and his administration have made a very great commitment and have made significant progress. That said, though, you can't view energy policy in a vacuum. And one of the real challenges for political leaders of both parties in recent years, and to an even greater degree going forward, is as we move toward a more environmentally conscious energy future, the costs of that energy are going to go up. The exploration, the production, and the use of it. And we saw the Biden administration last year taking steps such as the release of reserves of oil reserves in order to increase the US's gasoline supply. A lot of very strong environmentalists criticized Biden, saying, well, no, if inflation is causing the price of gasoline to go up, that will make people drive less, and that's a good thing. But Biden and many other Democrats and most Republicans said, no, if you make gasoline unaffordable, you're going to cause real harm to working class Americans. And Biden and his advisors are smart enough to know politically that if gasoline prices had continued to skyrocket the way they had been in the spring and early summer, that the likelihood of Democrats maintaining control of either house of Congress was pretty close to zero. So on one hand, Biden and his administration really have moved very aggressively on climate change matters, but they are constrained by economic realities, and that leaves a very uneasy balance that, as I said earlier, no political leader of either party has offered, in my mind, a satisfactory answer to.
Turning sort of back to the speaker issue, but also to the future, this audience member asked if a small group of more right-wing Republicans emerge from the speaker battle with disproportionate power in the House, what issues will they focus on, and especially what will happen when the debt ceiling comes up for increase or extension?
Well, the debt ceiling is probably the one issue that conservatives have prioritized where there could be a very impactful change of direction. McCarthy himself has made it clear that he was not going to fight to increase the debt ceiling. And in fact, there was probably sighs of relief all around Washington when the outgoing Congress voted to raise the debt limit in December, so it would not fall to the incoming Congress. But while McCarthy had pledged to fight an increase in the debt limit, in the debt ceiling, it's been widely suspected that he would find a way to allow just enough Republicans to vote for it to allow the ceiling to be raised. And a more conservative, less ideologically flexible speaker might be less inclined to do so. On most of the other issues that the anti-McCarthy forces have raised, these are issues like term limits, these are issues like a border wall. They're all issues that are important to conservatives, but would never make it out of a Democratic Senate and would certainly never be signed into law by a Democratic president. But what has become clear over the last few days is that McCarthy's opponents in the Republican caucus are not really fighting because they want a different policy direction than McCarthy has promised. If anything, many of them want to see different rules in the way the House is administered, particularly what it would take to remove a House Speaker from his or her office. And more of these no on McCarthy votes have made it clear over the last day or two that there isn't a policy matter or a rule change that would be acceptable to them, that they either simply don't like Kevin McCarthy or don't trust him. McCarthy over the years has done a very effective job of building friendships and building alliances among both centrist and conservative Republicans. And now what you have is a group of 20 or so conservatives who simply don't trust him. And many, while some of them have asked for rule changes or policy changes, most of them are saying, we don't trust him. And that it's a personal matter, not a political or policy one. So if they were to carry the day, unlike a compromise candidate of the type that we were talking about earlier, a Cole or a McHenry, then you're more likely to see someone like McCarthy's number two, the Republican whip, Steve Scalise of Louisiana, stepping in as speaker, who would not take the caucus in a different policy direction, but who conservatives would feel like they would more trust. So to sum up, are there policy areas that these rebels would like to move? Of course. Will anything happen on those fronts? Probably not. But this isn't political anymore, it's personal. And that's why it's going to be so difficult for McCarthy to recover.
So for our final question of the evening, one that's probably timely for many of us who are traveling this week, the New York Times refers to Southwest as California's airline. How might California's state and national politicians address Southwest's recent crisis to prevent another occurrence in the future?
Well, because Southwest operates in almost every state in the country, not just California, it's probably less of a matter for the California state legislature and more of a matter for the United States Congress and the Biden administration. And Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has made it very clear that as far as he's concerned, this went from being a weather-based emergency to simply a failure to effectively operate a vital transportation link. And there will almost certainly be congressional investigations and Biden administration efforts to dramatically revamp Southwest's operating procedure. Some of it has to do with the level of staffing that airlines are required to have on hand. That way, if a flight gets canceled, there's backup crew available. So some of it is staffing levels. Some of it is technology. Southwest simply has not invested nearly as much as most of the other airlines in this type of technology to reroute planes and redirect crews. And my guess is there will be minimum standards passed into law, either by executive order or through legislation in the next year or two. But the most complicated question, and I don't know that this is one that can be handled legislatively, at least not by a divided government like ours, is Southwest, as most of us know, operates its routes in a much different way than all the other airlines. All the other major airlines have what they call a spoke system. And whether you're flying on United through Chicago, or on Northwest through Minneapolis, or on Delta through Atlanta, or on American through Dallas, the planes come into these hubs and then fly out of them. So that way, if there's cancellations, you have a large number of planes and a large number of crew that can be redeployed in other directions. Southwest doesn't use hubs. They fly directly with more intermittent stops. And on one hand, that makes travel more cost efficient. Under normal circumstances, it means that there are fewer delays rather than more because you don't have bottlenecks in Dallas or Chicago or Denver like you do with the other airlines. But in situations like this, it leaves them horribly exposed. Because if you're not bringing all your pilots and all your crew and all your planes into these hubs, you're much more at the mercy of the elements. Because if you have a plane in Burbank and it needs to fly out of Long Beach, there's really nothing you can do about that. Whereas with the hub, there's something that can be done. So there will be legislation passed, and it'll address technology, it'll affect staffing, it'll address financing. But again, I don't know if there's something the federal government can do to force an airline to fly according to certain routes. Although, given the talent that Secretary Buttigieg has showed for attracting political and public attention over the years, I suspect we'll find out this year whether it's possible or not.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dan. That's a great explanation. And thank you to our audience for submitting so many wonderful questions. If we didn't get to yours, hopefully we'll be able to get to it on our Continuing the Conversation segment, which Dan and I will record later this month.
And I have to say, Rachel, if I can interrupt for just one moment, I try to come prepared for almost any policy question that our really smart audience can ask us. I wasn't as ready for a question about airline policy, so I'm glad we muddled it through okay. So, but before we go, I do want to once again thank everybody for joining us. It's nice to see such a great audience for our first webinar of the year. And once again, Rachel, I want to thank the members of the other World Affairs Councils who are with us today. And like all of us, I want to pass on my best thoughts to Kim and her husband, hoping for a successful recovery.
Yes, definitely. We are thinking of them. And yeah, you did a great job with the airline question, Dan, so don't worry.
Yeah.
But we also have a number of exciting programs coming up and want to thank you as well for your continued viewership and support as we enter this new year. On January 25th, we have a conversation with Anne Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America, that'll be moderated by our board member, Bob Abernathy. On February 5th, we have an in-person event in partnership with Writer's Block. We'll be hosting Nina Totenberg, who is a well-known NPR correspondent, and she will be speaking about her new book, Dinners with Ruth, which focuses heavily on her friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That will be at the JAMS Performing Arts Center in Santa Monica, so we hope to see you in person there. On February 7th, we have another session of the Dan Schnur political report coming up. So really looking forward to that one. And then on February 8th, we'll be hosting former ambassador of to the Republic of Korea, Kathleen Stevens, in conversation with the former president and CEO of of the Rand Corporation, Jim Thompson. Ambassador Stevens is now the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and they'll be discussing the US role in security in Northeast Asia. Is there a solution to the North Korea problem? So a lot of really great programs coming up. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight. We hope to see you at the after session if you're one of our members, and to see you at one of our upcoming programs otherwise. So thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.